Hey my friends, I'm Corey, and do you know what a wet palette is? Hey my friends, welcome to this new video. I was really surprised to know that a lot of hobbyists not only never ever used a wet palette, but don't even know what a wet palette is. And it's surprising to me because a wet palette is one of the greatest tools that a miniature painter can use while painting miniatures. My experience with a wet palette has been great. I've used a wet palette for years now, so here I am showing you what a wet palette is, how to use it, and how to build it yourself, because maybe you don't want to invest some money into a professional wet palette. Maybe you want to try with a more cheap version of a wet palette to see if it could work for you, but I'm pretty sure that you are going to love it. At least I cannot paint without a wet palette. Since I started to use a wet palette years and years ago, I have never stopped using it. I never came back to a dry palette because it's such a great tool. But what is a palette? Well, generally speaking, a palette is a piece of plastic in which you squeeze your paint so that you can thin them, work with them, mix them, wet blend, etc. A wet palette works basically the same way as a dry palette, but with a key difference that use water to keep your paint constantly thin so that you can work with your paint for hours and hours and hours of painting session. Not only that, but you can still use your paint even the day after you have squeezed them on your wet palette because you use a sponge. It's a very simple project. It sounds very complicated, but it's very easy and a simple process. Also to build a wet palette, it's very simple. Now you can buy a wet palette. A lot of different manufacturers out there sell their own wet palette. The first one that came in my mind is the Redgrass Game wet palette. As a matter of fact, my wet palette is a Redgrass Game one. It was my very first professional wet palette, and I'm still using it to this day. But I know that Green Stuff World make their own wet palette, Army Painter, even Vallejo, I guess. I don't know, I have to check it out, but I also know that maybe Vallejo does their own wet palette. Games Workshop don't sell a Citadel wet palette, which is kind of strange that we don't have a overpriced version of a wet palette from Games Workshop. Maybe we'll see that in the future, but till now, till the making of this video, Games Workshop doesn't sell a wet palette, strangely enough, but who knows? But if you don't want to buy one, you can build one, and I will show you how to do that. It's a very simple process. Let's go to the hobby table so that I can show you how to build your own wet palette. This is my wet palette. I bought it from Redgrass Games many years ago, and I think it shows. It's pretty ruined, really dirty, and the orange plastic cover melted in one point because I distractedly put a bottle full of paint remover on its top. But this is proof of how durable these palettes are. As I said, there are many wet palette manufacturers, but it's really easy to make your own with cheap tools that are really easy to find. The first tool that you are going to need is a container, preferably with a lid to prevent the water that we are going to pour inside to evaporate. You can use a glass container, like this one used for storing food in the fridge, or a plastic one. I have recycled this little Games Workshop Tufts plastic box. Next, you'll need a sponge. A sponge soaked in water is the core element so that our paints will never dry in our palette. I found out that the sponge growth are particularly good for this kind of use, primarily because since these are pretty thin, you can easily cut them out in the size that will fit your container. Now put the sponge inside the container and pour some water in it. Don't pour too much, you just need enough water to keep the sponge soaked. Now the last tool that we need, a piece of parchment paper. This special kind of paper will let the moisture from the sponge constantly thin our paint, never letting them dry out. Just cut a piece of parchment paper to the size of the sponge and then place it onto it. It will wrinkle a little bit at the beginning, but don't worry, it would flatten immediately after. Also, try to remove as many air bubbles as possible. Now the only thing to do is to put your paint in the wet palette and paint as usual. You'll see that even after hours of painting session, your paint will still be thin and usable. As a little test, I squeezed some paint into my DIY wet palette and into a classic dry palette. And still, after many hours, the paint in the wet palette is still thin and ready to be used. Alright, my friend, thank you very much. Let me know down in the comment what you think about a wet palette, if you already own one and use one, if you don't even know what a wet palette was and now you want to try one, let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Also, in the meantime, if you want, you can leave a like, you can subscribe if you want to see more videos, and in the description there are links for my Instagram, which I don't use a lot, but sometimes I put my stuff there if you want to check it out, and also a way to support me if you want to support me. This, I guess, is the end of the video. I am on the verge of a heat stroke right now. It's summer, there are like 300 bajillion degrees outside. I can't wait for winter to come back. I'm tired. It's horrible, right? Anyway, my friends, enough rambling. I hope to see you next time. I'm Corey. Ciao, ciao.